like, unless this weather scared them away. Might get a little rainy, but that's why we're underneath this greenhouse today. So we're talking about citrus. So, but first off, I want to introduce myself. My name is Todd Schweeder. I am their diagnostic manager here. So I sit in a desk over in the main store over here to our left, or my left, and pretty much help people with their plant problems. So if you ever have questions, need someone to diagnose something, my team or I can most likely get you in the right direction on how to help plants out. So I got a degree in horticulture industry for 15 plus years. So I like this industry. I like being around plants and all that jazz. Citrus is, at least in Utah, is definitely more of they don't grow here naturally. They don't grow outside. We're too cold for them. So they're more of a hobby plant of sorts in Utah. But they can be really fun ones. The nice thing about citrus is that they can be productive, like they can actually produce fruit even when they're very small, unlike apple trees, or where they have to be fairly big and mature in order to really produce well. In most cases, I have seen bonsai apple trees that are really small, but that's a process. Citrus are pretty easy in that regard, in that usually you can have pretty good success with production and still keep them in a small plant, in a small container size, allowing them to be houseplants and still get citrus and fruit and things like that off of them. So they're really fun plants in that regard. And so this class here is just to try to give people some general knowledge for those who want to try this, or who have citrus fruit and just want to kind of further their understanding on how to help. So you, in general, we'll be just doing the lecture or the spill, and then I'll usually open it up for questions. So if you have questions, write them down as we go through, and we'll answer, and we can revisit those questions as we go. So hopefully it will be educational for you, and you learn something new today. So citrus is general knowledge. Citrus are citrus. So you have like your oranges, your lemons, your limes, your kumquats, your like those, not nectarines. Yeah, nectarines are citrus. Yeah. And so there's a wide variety of plants out there. And they're all, in general, I'm pretty sure if I was like a dedicated citrus farmer, I would probably know the nuances between maybe how to grow an orange versus a lemon or whatever. But in general, citrus are citrus, and they all kind of fit the same needs and categories. So really, what we're going to kind of go over is going to be about the same for all the different varieties of citrus that are out there. Because of Utah, we can't grow them outside, or else they will get, they'll die in our cold weather. They only handle about, the lowest they can go is about 20 degrees. Now, they don't like going that low, but they can survive that low. Normally, we say don't let it go below about 45 degrees when in the ground and whatnot. So that's just a kind of, and that's why we want to put them as a pot. So hopefully you all should have our little citrus handout. In general, I'm just going to kind of go through this. This will be for you to take home to kind of as a reference. There should be pens if we add any extra information to it that you need. But we're going to kind of start with container selection and transplanting. Generally speaking, not just citrus, but most plants, but this is also true for citrus, is usually you don't want to go too big too fast when it comes to container grown plants. So for example, this is what we call a #1 pot. In the industry, we call it a #1 gallon size. It's not a true gallon, but it's a #1 pot. And generally speaking, if I was to transplant this, let's say it gets to a point where I need to bump it up to another plant size, I normally do not want to bump it up too big fast. So normally the general rules, I just want to bump it up to the next size up. So a 2-gallon or a 3-gallon size. If I have something bigger, kind of like these plants over here, this is what we call a 5-gallon pot size. If I needed to bump this up to, like, it's starting to get root bound, I need to bump it up. Again, I don't want to all of a sudden go to a 25-gallon container or something. I normally just want to bump it up to the next size up, let it grow, and then bump it up again as needed. Now, these just came in earlier this spring, the citrus that we have, and they, in general, are probably just fine in these containers for at least a few years, I would imagine, at least 1 year, if not more. So these plants are usually fine. One way to kind of just test or to check is just to kind of pop it out of the pot here. And okay, I've seen some roots. It's rooted in there, but I'm also seeing a lot of soil. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of soil space in between the roots. This plant would be at least fine for another year in this pot. Okay, root systems in general like to be tight. Okay, they don't like a lot of excess space. Also, if you put it in a too big of a pot, it can kind of throw off your watering schedule, which we'll go over in a second. But selecting the pot, normally you just want to kind of go in the size up. The other thing that I would recommend when planting, and this is true for houseplants as well, not just citrus, I'm not a big fan of transplanting it into like a normal pot. So I have like this big pot right here. I could, if I wanted to, transplant this plant into the pot itself, but then it creates problems, in my opinion. One, if I have a bug problem, or if I have a soil problem, or if I needed to check to see if the root system was getting too tight, it's really hard to lift a big pot like I just did with this one and pop it out, check it. It's really hard to kind of move it around potentially because it's in this big pot. So I prefer kind of like what we have here, where I'm using the pot as just dressing, as outside clothing. So I leave it in the plastic pot and then just insert it into a nice pot to make it look nice. Some people will then go and put moss or something around it just to kind of make it look like it was planted. But then that leaves it open for the options of like care. Oh, it has a bug problem. It's easier to pull that out, take it outside and spray it down than to try to lift the whole like ceramic pot out with the pot and things like that. So as far as containers, I often recommend not putting it in the actual pot. Leave it in a plastic pot and just insert it into a nice pot. Other considerations, though, especially if you were like, oh, I do, if you are putting it into like a nice pot or transplanting it into a nice pot, not like soggy soil. Good, well-drained soils. So we want to make sure there's some good drainage. So like you can see, there's a lot of holes on the bottom. This is sufficient drainage, but sometimes when you insert it in a nice pot, the pot just has like one big hole in the bottom. And depending on if it gets clogged or how you're doing it, if that one hole may not drain well enough, and then it can kind of build up the water in the soil, and that can be problematic for your pot or for your citrus. So we want to make sure there's some really good drainage in the holes to kind of do that. The only thing, and this is true for a lot of plants, but we want to, if you are transplanting or you do need a transplant because you pulled it out or you looked at that root system and it is just so tight, then when you transplant it, often I'll kind of maybe break the root systems up. I don't want to like mess with it too much, but I want to loosen it up just to encourage it to keep growing out. And then I want to make sure when I transplant it again, I do not what we call the root flare. So the root flare is where the trunk transitions into the roots. If we bury that root flare too deep, it can sometimes cause stress to the plant, further damaging it or making it so it doesn't perform as well, making it more receptible to other issues. So just looking at this, often I go in here and I kind of started pulling away and there's a root right there. So I can kind of see where the root flare is. So if I was to transplant this into another container, I would want to make sure I keep that soil pretty much at that level. I don't want to put it too deep and then fill it with soil that goes above that root flare. So those are some things to keep in mind when picking a container and choosing what plant you want, or not plant you want, but like how you want to put it, where you want to store it in your house and things. Also with big pots, if you have more soil, like as it gets bigger, that soil is going to get heavier. And if you're putting it into a nice pot, especially if it's like a ceramic pot, the heavier gets. And these plants do have to come in during the winter or else they'll die. So just keep that in mind as well in your future plans of your pot. It's like, okay, yeah, if you get a bigger pot, you'll have a bigger tree and you'll probably have more fruit, but then you're hauling something a lot bigger in and out of the house. That might be more problematic or maybe difficult. There are like saucers on wheels that you can kind of help move that, but you also usually have like some kind of threshold that could maybe be difficult to get around. So just things to keep in mind. The next thing is lighting and location, because now we have you have a pot, you have a plant, you have it in a pot, you've just figured that out. But now where do you place it? So there's two options as far as placement. One is you leave it inside your house at all times. Or the other option is you put it outside during the summer and then you bring it inside during the winter. Either case, citrus, if you want fruit, that is, and flowers and fruiting, they need at least 6 to 8 hours of good sunlight. Now, good sunlight doesn't necessarily mean direct sunlight, okay? Especially if it's in an indoor environment. Normally, we just want bright, filtered light. But some direct sunlight can be helpful for that plant. So things that often if it's outside, our hot afternoon sun can be really intense, especially if it's up against like the siding of your house. So we usually recommend more of an east or a north side facing where it gets the sun in the morning, gets 6 or 8 hours of sun in the morning and then shaded in the afternoon, or get some really bright light. If it's always indoors or during the winter when you bring the plant in, that you want to try to do a really bright room. Now, things to kind of determine. One, north or east facing windows tend to be more of a damp light. And so you need to maybe put the plant closer to the window if you have any east or north facing windows in order to get enough light. If you have a south or west facing, those are usually the windows that get more of that hot afternoon sun. Okay, so if you have it in those ones, you may not want to put it directly in that sunlight because that could be really intense. Indoor environments tend to be more dry than outdoor environments, and so that heat can actually be more damaging. So you may need to kind of pull it away from those windows more in the center of the room than really up against those areas. So those, just to kind of think of where to placement. Now, you still need 6 to 8 hours. If you do not have a good place that gives a good 6 to 8 hours of bright light in that room or some direct light, you may need to consider some kind of grow lamp or grow light, something that will supplement that tree so that it gets the light it needs. If it doesn't get the light, like I said earlier, it can affect how well it blooms, how many blooms it has, and may affect how it can. You might just have a green tree, which is fun, but half the fun with citrus is that you can get fruit. So if you want fruit, light is very important. Okay, and then the other thing is like kind of like I talked about, bringing, if you are doing the outside indoor during the winter thing, 45 degrees is probably a good temperature gauge of when to determine to bring it indoors. So when we start getting some night temperatures around 45, then that's probably a good indication that we need to transition the plant from an outdoor to an indoor area. Since we're talking about that, I'm going to skip watering requirements and soil fertilizer for a second here, and I'm going to go talk about acclimatization. Acclimatizing. There you go. My brain. Climatizing. There is a few things to keep in mind. Okay. If you go, let's say it's fall, it's starting to get cold, and you're transitioning your plant from outdoors to indoors. Okay. Normally, because you're keeping it in a fairly warm condition, bringing it indoors to a fairly warm condition, that transition can be fairly easy on the plant. And there's usually maybe not as much of issues when doing that. But you know your indoor, sometimes we have our AC on and it over. Sometimes a house can be either hotter or warmer than it is outside, depending on heat or AC. So there might be a little bit of transition. The idea with a transition is you just don't want to like all of a sudden change the environment overnight, essentially, or in that moment, because that moment of transition can sometimes shock the plant. So if you feel that the transition is somewhat a big transition, also light can be that same transition. If it's going from a light, very bright outdoor patio and all of a sudden going into a darker room, that can be part of that transition as well and can kind of affect the plant. So sometimes you need to alchemize, where you bring it indoors for an hour or two, then put it back outside, or bring it in just for the night and then put it back outside, but then slowly add the hours up, go from like 2 to 4 to 6 to 8 to the whole time in your indoor environment. So normally I tell people when trying to do that transition, to give yourself at least a week for a good transition. Now, on the flip side, in the spring, if you're trying to take your plant from indoors to outdoors, that transition can sometimes be even more of a longer transition on your plant. We often have our heat on. It's a very dry heat during the winter. We have our furnace running. That dry heat can really kind of, and then all of a sudden, if you put it outside where it's it gets dipped down at night to those 45 degrees, that can sometimes be pretty aggressive on the plant. So again, giving yourself a week or two and slowly putting it outside, having that transition can be very helpful in making sure the plant doesn't get shocked. Citrus trees, I've noticed some citrus trees, when they get shocked, they just drop all their leaves all of a sudden, it seems like, and then you're like, oh no. Now, often they will come back. I have seen citrus completely defoliate, but the wood is still alive, and then it sends out new growth and it's fine. But that, obviously, that puts extra stress, may postpone how likely it will fruit, because it has to put new energy in developing new leaves and things like that. But so doing that transition, I think our paperwork has a good kind of description there that can kind of help give some guidelines. But that's the intention behind the transition, is to try to help prevent that shock on the plant. As far as transitioning it from outdoors to indoors in the fall, we often start turning our heat on. And as far as plant location, you may also want to consider doors, like doors that go to the outside. Are you going to have a flush of cold air? Are you going to have a flush of hot air coming in and blowing on the plant? That can be a shocking event on a plant, especially if it's like 0 degrees outside and you have it right by your door, and every time you open it up to get in and out, that rush of air kind of freezes, and that can shock it. So something to be considered about. Also, vents. When you have your furnace on and that hot air is blowing, that can also be a shocking event, especially if it's like a consistent, like it turns on every hour, and that air blowing on it. So you want to make sure you find a location where that air isn't blowing on it. And that's also true for houseplants in general as well. But just things to keep in mind when you're trying to decide how you want to take care of your citrus tree, where you want to put it. Going back to water requirements, the general rule for citrus is they like to be evenly moist, not too wet and not too dry. Now, one way to kind of, what I usually do, and I do this for a lot of plants, not just citrus, but first of all, you can feel just the top. Right now I feel some moisture, so there's obviously some moisture in there. But often the top will dry out faster than what's down lower. So often I like to just stick my finger in to the first or second knuckle, and I like to feel how wet that soil is. Right now, there's it feels very moist in this example, and so it does not need watering at this time. But if that top 1 or 2 inches starts to feel dry, that's usually an indication that it needs to be watered. Now, you can buy things kind of like moisture meters. They help. It's similar to your finger. I find my finger is better just because I know what it feels like. When I put a moisture meter in there, sometimes it's like, okay, it says it's at a moist number 4, but what does that really mean? So I often like to kind of, if you do like to use a moisture meter, I like to kind of put my finger in, okay, and then put the thing in and says, okay, so that's what moist 4 means, is at this level kind of thing, just to have a better gauge of what the soil meter is telling you. So that's just something but it keeps your finger from getting dirty as often, I guess. But it is a useful tool. Bigger plants, when watering, you want to make sure that at the time of watering, the general rule is usually want to get the whole root ball. And that's why if you put it in a really big pot and you have this little plant, it can kind of throw off how you're watering. So that's why the general rule is you just kind of bump it up as you go. It keeps the root system nice and tight, but it also helps with watering properly. So that's kind of the general rule with watering. Now, in an indoor environment, it may be more dry, especially during the winter. It's going to be more dry during the winter. And so that with just the furnace on, it's going to dry out that air. So you may need to consider humidity. Okay. And so misting the leaves can be helpful. You can also put, like, if you have like some kind of tray that catches water underneath it, sometimes putting rocks in that tray. So then as it evaporates, it kind of adds a little bit more of like a higher humidity bubble in that area. So misting or rocks on trays, things like that can be a useful way to help bring that humidity up to kind of help it from drying out. And then just keep in mind that different soils are different. So if someone says, oh, I need a water every once a week, that may not be the case. Feel the soil, feel how dry it's getting between watering. Because if you water it once a week, maybe your soil is holding more moisture and you need to water every other week. Or maybe your soil dries out super fast. And if that's the case, then maybe you need to water multiple times a week. So everyone's environment is going to be a little different. Also, if you have it in a really sunny location versus a more of a shady location, if you get 8 hours of sun versus 6 hours of sun, it may change how often you need to water. Okay, so that's why I really recommend doing your finger, feeling the soil, or doing like getting a water meter, something that will help gauge and kind of fine tune how often you need to water your plant. So those are some thoughts on watering. Also on soil and fertilizing. Soil, I would say usually when people come in with problems on their plants, not usually, but a common one I see is that they've transplanted their plant into a new pot or something and it died really quickly. And like, what's wrong? And it's like, most of the time is the soil that they used was too heavy, or they used outdoor soil that's like mostly clay in Utah. Okay, and those kind of issues is just very, very heavy soil. Citrus really need really good drainage. So a lot of people say in general you're probably fine with just a basic potting mix. This is mostly peat moss, so it drains well, it has some good moisture retention, it's not going to be really soggy. So generally speaking, you're probably fine just doing something straight like this. However, if you know you live in an area that it's not going to dry out well, or you don't have good drainage in the bottom of your pot, potentially adding something like perlite could help lighten up the load, make it drain better. You could also, if you're like, oh, it's drying out too fast, but you still need good drainage, vermiculite might be an option as well. And then we also have something called Coco Coir. Coco Coir is kind of a substitute for peat moss. It helps with drainage and things, but it's more sustainable. So those are possible options that you could try with helping that soil have really good drainage. As far as pH, in general, citrus prefer slightly acidic soil, but most plants prefer slightly acidic soil. But citrus can usually handle a pretty wide range. So in general, you don't probably need to worry too much about the pH of your soil. It's kind of a non-issue when it comes to citrus. So as long as you have a good drainage, you're most likely going to be just fine. Last year, I remember a guy came in with, he had taken like a gallon and he had transplanted it into a 10-gallon pot. So that's already a one no-no because he went so big. And then two, he just took soil from his garden. And that's really heavy soil. That was a second no-no. I'm like, sorry, this plant just doesn't have any chance, really. So, so things to consider: really well-drained soil, something that holds that moisture but allows excess moisture to drain. Make sure you have a good pot that has good drainage so it doesn't hold that moisture and cause it to have issues with excess water. Fertilizing is always a good option. There's a lot of different fertilizers out there. that are specifically maybe designed for citrus. For example, I have this Garden in Bloom citrus and fruit tree. It's just a 842, so this is your NPK. But fertilizers. So in general, as long as you're not doing something that's specifically for lawns that has like a huge amount of nitrogen, you're probably going to be fine in a lot of cases. Often if you are transplanting, or like I recommend something like a root stimulator would be good on citrus. It's a low nitrogen, high in the middle number to encourage root development. So fertilizer is good, but maybe find like do your research. But in general, as long as you kind of do a lower number, something kind of like this one where it's like nothing too big and like nothing above 10, something like that should help kind of give it a boost. Normally you want to fertilize more in the spring, but you can kind of, depending on the fertilizer you have, you can potentially fertilize throughout the whole season if needed. Yeah, like if you use this one, I think they recommend every 3 months through the growing season. But we have liquid fish. Sometimes citrus can get an iron deficiency. We get it here sometimes, just the nature of the kind of water we have, it kind of flushes out those irons and stuff. So adding and doing a chelated iron may be helpful to kind of help it along.
How can you tell if it has that?
An iron deficiency, how can you tell? So iron is usually, so a plant will go yellow for a lot of reasons, okay? And it could be nitrogen, it could be iron, there are other nutrients, it could be overwatering, it could be underwatering. There's a lot of reasons why a plant may go yellow. But iron is what we call a non-relocatable nutrient, meaning once a leaf is green, it stays green. Okay, and so it cannot, so as the new growth comes on, it can't take, if it's deficient in iron, it can't steal that iron from old leaves to keep the new leaves green. And so normally if you have an iron deficiency, you'll see it on the younger leaves, and you'll see, and the veins will be a dark green where the leaf itself is yellow. So it'll be a yellow leaf with green veins is a really good indication of an iron deficiency. Nitrogen, for example, can steal nutrients from the old leaves to keep the newer growth more green and vibrant. Okay, so if the new leaves are starting to turn yellow, or the old leaves are starting to turn yellow, and the new leaves are staying green, then that could be an indication of a nitrogen deficiency. So kind of depending on old versus new. So if it's the old new stuff turning yellow, it could be a sign of iron deficiency. Now there are other problems like overwatering, underwatering that can, so it's kind of, you still have to kind of maybe do some diagnostics and kind of gauge like, am I watering it properly? If I am and it's going yellow, maybe that's an indication of a nutrient problem. So those are some ideas for fertilizer. Now we're going to skip recommended varieties. To be honest, I am not much of a citrus connoisseur. I've never really grown anywhere like that, so I don't necessarily have my personal opinions of which are best. Meyer lemons are a very popular one, so people like that. There is one called improved Meyer lemon. The improved, it's the same thing. It's just the plant has been improved in a way that makes it less less receptive to diseases and potential pest problems. But let's move over to pollination. Pollination is a really important one to look into. Pollination, normally a citrus is what we call self-fertile, meaning that by itself, it can it will produce fruit. You don't have to cross pollinate like apple trees do or pear trees and some plums. Like in general, it is considered self-pollinating. Now, self-pollinating doesn't mean that it still needs to be pollinated, but it can pollinate itself. Okay, so if you have it outside during when it's in bloom, like if you put it outside in the spring and it blooms, then most likely the bees will find it and pollinate the plant for you. But because, and in general, most fruit trees bloom in the spring and sometimes in the fall, but because of Utah climate and the potential chance of bringing it indoors and outdoors or just leaving it indoors, sometimes it throws off its normal cycle, because like if you leave it indoors all the time, it's almost opposite. We turn on the AC, we keep it cooler, it stays cold, and then when it gets hot, we turn on the heat, and then it gets hot at winter, and it's almost opposite in our indoor environment than it is in nature, where during the spring it gets really warm, and then during the winter it gets cold. It's almost opposite. So sometimes that can kind of throw the plant off. And so sometimes citrus in our environment and how we take care of them, sometimes the blooming cycle isn't as predictable on citrus. So you may need to, it may not bloom when you put it outside, and it may only bloom when you have it indoors. And if it blooms while it's indoors and you don't have access to bees in your house to pollinate, then you may need to pollinate it yourself. On our care sheet here, we have a little diagram of a simple, of a flower, not necessarily specifically a citrus flower, but all flowers are fairly similar, or they're all pretty much the same in general. And because it can self-pollinate, each flower has what we call both male and female parts. Okay, so the male part are called the stamen, okay, and that is your anther and filament. And then you have the pistil, which is the female parts, which is the stigma, style, right? And ovary. And so the goal, and we looked for a plant here that had a flower. So after the lecture, or if you need further looking at it, we had a flower here that was opening up here, and I can show you in better detail what we're trying to do. But if you are going to pollinate it yourself, essentially what you do is the pollen is on the anthers, and you have to get like a soft toothbrush or a Q-tip or something that can gather that pollen, okay? And then you have to go to another flower, because the pollen won't necessarily pollinate the same flower. So you have to go to a new flower, and then you want to rub that pollen on the stigma, which is usually a bigger one in the middle of the flower. And so you're trying to get the pollen to the stigma. Now, normally bees, when they get in there and they're rubbing it, and then they go to another flower and they do that for you and rub it. But if in an indoor environment, you would need to do that yourself if it blooms when it's inside your house. Okay. And then hopefully you'd got enough pollen that something was able to get to the ovary of the flower, allowing it to produce into fruit. So now, some problems that I've seen with people is they get it going, they start the fruit starts to set, but then it falls off prematurely. Often premature fruit drop could either mean one, it didn't get pollinated properly, and so it started to do something, but then it's like, oh, I'm not pollinated, and so it let it drop early. Or two, light or improper watering. Not enough light or not enough or improper watering, whether it's drowning or getting too drought stressed. Those are usually the main causes of fruit dropping off your plant. If it starts to kind of, you're like, oh, I got fruit going, and then all of a sudden it drops, that could be an indication of that problem. Or those are potential problems that could indicate why your fruit are dropping. So those are things to maybe just be aware of. So the process itself isn't too hard, especially on citrus, where I find that they're smaller plants. You can do it. Obviously, pollinating a large tree in your backyard would be a lot more difficult, like an apple tree. Hence the need to try to be cautious about bees, and things like that. So in your yard, I'm getting a little plug in for the bees there. Save the bees. Okay. So harvesting. Now, for those who are from around this area, when you think of apple trees, pear trees, other kind of fruit trees that grow in this area, you have a big flush of flowers in the spring. They produce, they ripen, and then you have a big harvest. Citrus are kind of funny in that regard because they don't do that. They tend to have a flush of flowers in the spring and in the fall, but because of our climate, it might change that. And so there usually is a flush, but fruit will not all ripen at the same stage. And so you could have one citrus, like a lemon, that ripens really quickly, where you have something that stays on the tree for like 12 months and then ripens. Okay, so citrus can be a little bit more aloof, and when they are ready to harvest, they can be more aloof in those kind of issues. Or not issues, but in when they're ready to harvest. So it can sometimes be deceiving. You're like, this green citrus has been on this for like 9 months. Is it ready to harvest? If it goes yellow, it is not ready to harvest. Citrus usually ripen from the inside out. And so normally you want to harvest it when it looks ready to use. So if it's like a lemon, you want to wait until it's actually yellow. Oranges are similar in that regard. You want to wait until it's actually orange on the plant before you harvest it. Obviously, limes might be a little bit more difficult because they're green. They don't necessarily change as much. But normally you can kind of usually they still kind of go from a darker green to a little bit more of a limey green. So normally they still have that you can kind of see. So that is kind of some basic, as far as they can kind of be funny in that regard, where they're kind of random in how they mature on the tree and ripen on the tree. The next thing is pruning. Now, normally citrus will grow on old and new wood. I believe some trees, if you really want to get into the weeds, some citrus trees prefer new wood versus old wood. Some trees don't care. Some trees prefer old wood versus new wood. So there can be some nuance here, but generally speaking, a citrus tree will bloom on any, so you don't have to like peach trees, for example, they grow on younger wood. And so you always have to prune it and to encourage new growth. Citrus, you do not need to do that necessarily. Citrus trees will produce on any wood that it has available. But generally speaking, they say citrus do not fruit on what we call suckers, or the ones that just go straight up. So, or often called water sprouts. So if you have they usually produce more on the branches that kind of go out. So when pruning a citrus and maintaining its size and shape and health, normally if you have anything that's just all of a sudden just goes straight up, those ones are really good ones to cut out. Yeah, this could be a very good example of a water sprout. And And as you can see, this plant is currently flowering, but there is no flowers on that stem. Okay, so that's kind of true to the general rule that they do not tend to flower on sprouts, on water sprouts. So encouraging, if as your grows and as it gets established, if you see those water sprouts, you want to, now I could cut this and it would encourage more growth out, and then it might work down the road if you want a bigger tree. But if you're like, oh, this plant, oh, go ahead and just cut out those really fast growing branches. Okay, unless you're wanting it to be bigger, then you could maybe use that and let it kind of grow from there. The other thing is pruning is allowing airflow, sunlight penetration, things like that. They like to be nice and airy and open. So normally you want to, the general rule for pruning, anything growing down you want to cut out. Anything growing towards the center, you kind of want to cut out. You want to try to make it more kind of growing out from the center,